The new 2026 ACC/AHA Dyslipidemia Guidelines tell you to get your high-risk patients to an LDL below 70 milligrams per deciliter, and your very high-risk patients below 55. Those are specific numbers. They appear on charts, in order sets, and they will drive prescribing decisions for the next decade. So here's my question. When the writing committee published that guideline on March 13, 2026, had anyone ever run a randomized trial where one group gets to a goal of 70 and another to 55? Do we know what happens when we compare the two? The answer is no. And here's where it gets interesting.
Interesting.
So these new guidelines justify the LDL targets using 4 trials: the IMPROVE-IT trial, the FOURIER trial, the ODYSSEY OUTCOMES trial, and the ORION trial. But none of them tested a target versus a target. Instead, they tested a drug versus placebo, and patients in the treatment arm happened to get to various levels of LDL. The guideline committee then looked at those levels and said, those are our targets. That is an inference. Maybe it's a reasonable one, but it's an inference. Let me show you what each trial actually demonstrated. The IMPROVE-IT trial was published in 2015. 18,000 patients that were hospitalized for acute coronary syndrome were randomized to simvastatin plus ezetimibe or simvastatin alone. At 6-year median follow-up, the LDL in the 2-drug group landed at 53.7 compared to 69.5 in the 1-drug group. The primary composite outcome occurred in 32.7% versus 34.7% with an absolute difference of 2 percentage points. Hazard ratio was 0.936 with a 95% confidence interval, that is 0.99 at the upper limit. So a few things worth knowing. The background statin was simvastatin 40 milligrams, which is moderate intensity by current ACC/AHA definitions. Today's post-ACS patient gets atorvastatin 80, and that comparator arm is not today's standard of care. The confidence interval runs from 0.89 to 0.99. The upper bound sits 1/100th a point away from the null. And all-cause mortality? Hazard ratio of 0.99, cardiovascular mortality, exactly 1. This trial moved a composite, but it did not move survival. And it was funded by ezetimibe's Baker. FOURIER was another trial published in 2017. 27,000 patients with established ASCVD that were already on a statin therapy were randomized to evolocumab versus placebo. The median follow-up was 2.2 years, which is really short for a cardiovascular outcomes trial. The reason is because the event rates were about 50% higher than projected, which is worth noting because stopping a trial early can inflate treatment effects. The LDL in the groups, 30 milligrams versus 92, with a primary composite outcome of 9.8 versus 11.3%. The hazard ratio was 0.85. So where's the rub? Cardiovascular mortality had a hazard ratio of 1.05. All-cause mortality, a hazard ratio of 1.04. Numerically going the wrong direction and not significant. The number needed to treat to prevent 1 cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke was 74 patients over 2 years. Evolocumab costs approximately $14,000 per year at the time of that trial. You do the math to determine how much 1 NNT costs.
I need to do some calculations!
The ODYSSEY Outcomes trial was published in 2018. 18,900 patients after acute coronary syndrome were randomized to alirocumab versus placebo with a median follow-up of 2.8 years. The primary composite outcome occurred in 9.5 versus 11.1% of patients that had a hazard ratio of 0.85. And here's the number that gets cited most often. All-cause mortality was 3.5 versus 4.1% with a hazard ratio of 0.85. So here's what the number actually means in the context of the trial. The statistical testing plan was hierarchical. Each endpoint had to reach significance before the next was formally tested. Coronary heart disease death was tested first. It had a hazard ratio of 0.92 and a p-value of 0.38, which was not significant. That should have stopped the hierarchy. All-cause mortality was never formally tested, but they report a nominal finding, not a pre-specified primary result. The benefit that does exist is concentrated almost entirely in patients with a baseline LDL above 100 milligrams per deciliter in a post-hoc subgroup. The number needed to treat for that group was 16. In the full population, it was 49. And for mortality in the entire population, it was 163. The final trial that went into determining LDL levels was the ORION, published in 2020. Inclisiran, a small interfering RNA that blocks hepatic PCSK9 synthesis, included 2 trials of about 3,200 patients with an 18-month follow-up. The primary endpoints in both trials were percentage change in LDL and time-adjusted LDL change. Those are the only primary endpoints. Cardiovascular events were exploratory endpoints, not adjudicated. ORION has no cardiovascular outcomes data, none, and inclisiran is now listed in the 2026 guideline with a Class 2A recommendation. 2 cardiovascular outcomes trials are currently ongoing, with results expected in 26 and 27. I said when the guideline was published, no trial had directly tested these 2 targets against each other, and that was accurate on March 13, 2026. On March 28, 2026, 2 weeks later, a trial called Ez-PAVE was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. 3,048 patients with established ASCVD were randomized to a target below 55 or below 70. Median follow-up here was 3 years. The primary composite occurred in 6.6 versus 9.7% of patients with a hazard ratio of 0.67. That is a meaningful result, and it is the first randomized trial to directly compare these targets. Now, let's read the fine print. Ez-PAVE was an open label trial, and you can't blind treat to target strategy when physicians need to see the LDL number to adjust. It was conducted at 17 sites in South Korea. Only about 60% of patients in the intensive group reached the assigned LDL target below 55 by the end of the trial. The primary endpoint was driven mainly by revascularization and non-fatal MI. Poo! Those are poos for sure, but not ones that patients care more about, like fatal events. And revascularization is iffy at best. Cardiovascular death had a hazard ratio of 0.83 with a 95% confidence interval of 0.42 to 1.65, not even close to significance. Ez-PAVE moves the needle. It doesn't settle the question, and the writing committee that drafted the 2026 guidelines never saw it. So here's my honest summary. The 2026 guidelines LDL targets are built on drug trials, not target trials. The committee looked at where patients landed in IMPROVE-IT, FOURIER, ODYSSEY, 53, 30, and 40 milligrams per deciliter respectively, saw event reductions, and extrapolated those levels into prescriptive thresholds. That is a defensible scientific inference, and the cholesterol treatment trials meta-analysis support continuous dose-response relationship. The biology is plausible and the direction is probably right. But 3 out of 4 foundational trials showed no all-cause or cardiovascular mortality benefit. The one mortality signal in ODYSSEY was nominal by hierarchical testing and concentrated in a post-hoc subgroup. ORION has no outcomes data at all. And the only trial that actually tested 55 versus 70 directly was published 2 weeks after the guideline in South Korea, open label with a soft primary composite and no mortality signal. That is the gap between lower LDL is probably better and your patient must reach 55. One has evidence, the other has inference. Your job is to know which is which. The collective evidence behind the 2026 treat to target recommendation gets a Castelli coefficient of 5.5 out of 10. Lower LDL probably matters. Whether it matters enough at the margin your borderline risk patient occupies, at the cost and risk of agents required to get there, is a conversation worth having with your patient. It's not a mandate stamped in a guideline. Until next time, this is Dispense is written.